Hi, everyone. Welcome to You've Got Mail, Now What? An Introduction to Email Security. My name is Leah Furyk, and I am a security engineer at a company in the healthcare sector. My role primarily focuses on incident response, but I've been working on an email security project for the last year, improving the email security at my company. I have a Bachelor of Science with a specialist in computer science from the University of Toronto. And in my spare time, I enjoy reading, cooking, and traveling. And you'll see some photos from some of the conferences I've attended in the last couple of years. I've also been working in cybersecurity for 3 years. So, plan for today is we're going to be focusing on 3 particular components of email security. They are SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. The reason I wanted to focus on these is they are very relevant to email security and the enterprise email environment. We're going to start by going through how email works at a high level. Then we're going to go through the different types of records that are important in email security: DNS, SPF, and DMARC. Then we are going to apply what we've learned about the different records by going through some example email headers. Finally, we're going to talk through implementing email security in the enterprise environment and the potential challenges you may face. I also threw in a movie poster from the You've Got Mail movie, just because it inspired me when I was working on this presentation. So let's begin with a high-level overview of how email works. First, an email is written in an email client. An email client is something like Outlook or Gmail. The email client takes the message and combines it with the recipient address, subject line, date, and timestamp in the email header. Next, the email client communicates with the email sender server. The email sender server uses the DNS record to look up the IP address of the recipient domain to determine where the email is to go. As an example, if you're emailing someone at chapters.com, it's going to use the DNS record to look up the IP address for chapters.com so it knows where to go. Next, the email client server connects to the recipient's mail server. The email is then sent. Then the recipient server checks the contents of the email, header, etc. And then the user can open up the email address, open up the email and read the contents. Like I said, this is a high-level overview, so there is a lot I left out. I didn't go into the email protocols used in email, and I also didn't touch on SPF, DKIM, or DMARC yet. I just wanted to talk through how email works overall before diving in. To start, let's discuss the DNS record. DNS stands for Domain Name System. The DNS record has instructions about how to handle requests about a domain, as well as information about the domain, like the IP address that is associated with the domain. There are multiple components of the DNS record, but we're only going to focus in on a few of them. First, we're going to talk about the TXT record. The TXT record is simply a record that stores text. We're going to want to remember this one because it's going to come up in the upcoming sections. Next, let's talk about the A record. The A stands for address, and this simply stores the IP address for a given domain. Now let's talk about the CNAME record. CNAME refers to colloquial name, and I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. It's essentially an alias record. It is used in lieu of an A record. It contains a domain address, which then references the A record. This allows for a domain to be referenced instead of an IP address in the DNS record. There is a limit of 1 CNAME per DNS record. While it is technically possible to have both an A record and a CNAME record, best practice is to use one or the other. Lastly, we're going to talk about the MX record. The MX record tells us how the email is to be routed. We aren't going to touch on this one any further, but I did want to mention it just because it's important for how email works. This is an example DNS record. You'll see that this is for the domain chapters.com. This screenshot is from an awesome free tool, MX Toolbox, that helps you look up different records associated with a domain. You'll see there are 2 A-type records. This means that there are 2 IP addresses associated with chapters.com. 216.220.60.60 and 54.208.24.193. We can also see a column titled TTL. The TTL is the time to live. This refers to how long a record is cached for. It can also be thought of as how long it takes for a record update to reach the end users. This means if you make a change in the DNS record to the record, it may take up to an hour to apply. This is something to keep in mind for the enterprise environment, and it means that changes won't instantly propagate. And so the TTL doesn't have to be 60 minutes, it's just 60 minutes in this particular example. Now that we've talked about the different records involved in email security, let's start talking about protocols. The first protocol we're going to talk about is DKIM. DKIM stands for Domain Keys Identified Mail. It involves public key cryptography. The key thing to understand about public key cryptography is that there are two keys involved, the public key and the private key. The public key is published in the domain's DNS record, and the private key is used by the sender to sign emails. The published public key can then be used by the email recipient to verify the email came from the sender. The above can be thought of as the DKIM signature. The DKIM signature verifies that the email came from the domain and has not been tampered with during transit. The process for DKIM signing is as follows. The sender's email platform makes a hash of text fields from the email, and the hash is encrypted using the email sender's private key. When the recipient receives the email, the recipient email platform verifies the signature using the sender's public key. It does this by decrypting the DKIM signature using the sender's public key to return to the original hash. The DKIM signature tells the recipient email platform what hashing algorithm was used. Then the recipient email platform creates its own hash of the fields included in the DKIM signature using the hashing algorithm specified. The two hashes are then compared. This check is how the recipient confirms that the email was not tampered with in transit. This is an example DKIM record. I'm just going to briefly take a sip of water. First, we have the name of the DKIM key. In this case, it's big-email._domainkey.example.com. The first part, big-email, is known as the DKIM selector. The DKIM selector must be unique in the DNS record. This is important to remember, as every sender that sends on behalf of a domain must have their own DKIM key. Email senders can be things like YWCA, Mailgun, SendGrid, etc. The DKIM key is generated by the email sender. The email sender keeps the private key, and a copy of the public key generated by the email sender is published to the DNS record for the domain. This allows the email senders to send on behalf of the domain. Next, we have the record type. In this case, it's a text record, like we talked about earlier. The DKIM record is always stored as a TXT record in the DNS record. Then we have the contents of the DKIM record. In the content section, we have V, the version, and in this case, it's referencing the DKIM protocol version, and the P tag is the public key. So there are two components of DKIM. We've gone through DKIM authentication, and this is what is typically used, but there is another component of DKIM. It's DKIM alignment. Passing DKIM alignment essentially means that the from domain in the email header and the DKIM domain in the DKIM signature header match. DKIM alignment matters more when you have an email sender like Mailjet, SendGrid, etc. that is sending on behalf of your domain. Let's sum up what we've learned about DKIM so far. DKIM needs to be set up for each email sender that sends emails on behalf of the domain. An email sender is something like SendGrid, AWS, SES, etc. And there are two components to DKIM: DKIM authentication and DKIM alignment. Now let's move on to the next protocol, SPF. So SPF refers to the Sender Policy Framework. SPF essentially confirms that the authorized sender for the domain is sending the email on the domain's behalf. It prevents spoofing. To break this down into a little bit more detail, SPF authentication means that the IP address or domain in the SPF record of the domain is allowed to send emails on behalf of the domain. To pass SPF authentication, the sender IP address must match an IP address listed as an authorized sender in the domain. And we're going to dive into this a little bit more detail. This is an example of an SPF record. Again, the V tag refers to the protocol version. It's a required tag and must be first in the record. The include tag allows an IP address or domain that is authorized to send emails on behalf of the domain. In this example, it means that the domain google.com is an authorized sender for our domain. Last, we have the all tag. This tells the recipient email server what to do if something doesn't match the SPF record. There are 3 common options for all. The -all means reject the email if something doesn't match the SPF record. The ellipse-all means treat the email as suspicious if something doesn't match the SPF record for the domain. The $all leaves the decision up to the recipient email server. As we talked about previously, an IP address or domain can be put in the SPF record to authorize the sender. But there are some risks to using a domain in the SPF record. By putting the domain, you're authorizing all IP addresses associated with the domain as authorized sender. Think about a large sender like Google or Amazon. This means that every address associated with google.com or amazon.com is allowed to send on your behalf. In theory, if a threat actor sent an email from Google on behalf of your domain, the email could pass SPF authentication because it's from an authorized sender. You'll hear people talk about SPF alignment and SPF authentication. SPF authentication is what we've talked about above. It just means that the email is being sent by an authorized sender according to the DNS record. SPF alignment is another component of SPF. It means that in the email header, the from domain matches the mail from return path domain. It's not necessary to pass SPF alignment to pass SPF. And the same is true for DKIM. You don't necessarily have to pass DKIM alignment to pass DKIM. Now, let's put it all together and talk about our third protocol, DMARC. DMARC refers to domain-based message-based authentication, reporting, and conformance. It's a bit of a mouthful, so we're just going to be calling it DMARC. DMARC tells the domain what to do when an email doesn't pass SPF and/or DKIM. Essentially, it provides specific instructions to receiving mail servers about how to handle emails sent from your domain. And you'll see that our chart here, where you'll see that we can pass DMARC by only passing DKIM or just by passing SPF. This is important to keep in mind when it comes to enterprise security, because sometimes it's easier to set up DKIM or SPF for a sender. You don't always have to set up both. However, in a perfect world, it's great to have both, just because it means that you're protected by both SPF and DKIM. This is an example DMARC record. Again, we have the version protocol tag. And again, it just needs to be, it's a required tag and it just has to be at the start of the record. We have a P tag, but in this case, it's the policy tag. This tells the recipient email server what to do when an email doesn't pass DMARC. The first possible value for the policy tag is none. This means continue the email regardless of the results. What I mean by that is, regardless of whether or not the email passed SPF or DKIM, the email just goes straight to the user. The email recipient server does nothing about it. The second possible value is quarantine. This means put the email in the quarantine folder if the email does not pass DMARC. The third possible value is reject. This means reject the email if it does not pass DMARC. In this case, the recipient never receives the email. This is always the goal, as this is the strongest security setting. The next two important tags for the DMARC record are RUA and RUF. RUA refers to the URL of the mailbox that's to receive DMARC reports. RUF is where to return failed or forensics reports. These tags can be helpful for monitoring DMARC pass rates. If you're using a vendor such as Proofpoint or Mimecast, typically their email addresses would go in the RUA and RUF tags. This allows them to monitor DMARC pass rates for your domains and also flag issues. But you can also put your own domains here so that you can monitor. Let's put it all together by walking through how email works with SPF, DKIM, and DMARC. Let's say we want to allow the email sender, SendGrid, to send an email on our behalf. First, we'll create a DKIM key within the email sender. We'll then publish the DKIM key in the DNS record of our domain. We'll then create an SPF record with the authorized IP address that SendGrid can use to send on our behalf. This is usually considered to be a dedicated IP address. We'll then have to wait for the changes to propagate due to the TTL. We'll also add in the DMARC policy for domain, and in our case, we're going to go with the strictest setting of P = reject. Next, we'll write the email, add in the recipient email address, and then send the email using SendGrid. Now, on the recipient side, first, the recipient mail server checks to see if there is a DMARC record. In our case, there is one, and the policy for it is P = reject. This means that if anything doesn't match, don't continue the email to the user. First, the recipient server checks the DKIM signature. Is it valid? Does it match the published public key? If it is, the recipient then decrypts the hash using the public key. Next, the recipient creates a hash of the specified header fields and compares its hash to the decrypted hash. If they match, then the email wasn't tampered with in transit. Therefore, the email passed DKIM. Next, it checks the sender IP address. Is an authorized sender according to the SPF record? In our case, yes, it is. Based on the above tests, apply the DMARC policy. The email passed all of the tests, so the email is continued to the recipient. This is a part of an email header. I wanted to show this because we've talked about the email header in previous slides, but what does it look like? To start, we can see that email is from Joe Fox at ny152@foxbooks.ca. It was sent to Kathleen Kelly at shopgirl@gmail.com. We have the subject and the date that it was sent. This matches what you'd see in the email client. So these fields are what would be displayed in the email client UI. This is another part of the email header. So to start, we're going to look at the SPF related components in the email header. We have the received-SPF, which is right here. In simple terms, this shows whether the sender passed or failed the SPF check. In our case, it passed the SPF check, and we'll see that pass right there. Next, we can see the authentication results in the email header. We can see that the email was sent by Mailjet on behalf of the domain, foxbooks.ca. This means that the email sender in this case is Mailjet. We can see that the email passed SPF, and this means that Mailjet is listed as an authorized sender in the SPF record. And so just so everyone can see, there is our Mailjet. And you can also see we've got the DKIM for as well as for mailjet.com because it's an authorized sender. And we also have that SPF = pass there. Digging in a little bit further, we can also see that foxbooks.ca also passed DKIM. We can start by looking at the D tag and the DKIM signature. So the D tag is right here for Foxbooks. Oh, sorry about that. This D tag stands for the signing domain. Since we have two DKIM signatures, we have two signing domains. So foxbooks.ca as well as bnc3.mailjet.com. Mailjet sent the email on behalf of Foxbooks, so we'll also see the DKIM signature results for Mailjet. At the top, we can see the results for both DKIM signatures, and we can see that both pass DKIM. We can also see the signing algorithm used by looking at the A tag. And the A tag is right here. So in both cases, the algorithm used is RSA-SHA-256. We then can look at the BH tag. This is the body hash. The H tag, right here, is a list of the signed header fields. The DKIM selector is found in the S tag. For Foxbooks, the DKIM selector is Mailjet. We can also see the DMARC results. The email passed DMARC for foxbooks.ca. And you'll notice that because there's a lot of information, sometimes it can be hard to find the fields. And this screenshot shows the entire email header. You notice there are a lot of fields we did not cover. There are a lot of resources out there that talk through every component of the email header, and if you're interested, I encourage you to pull up an email from your inbox and walk through the different components within the email header. Now let's talk about implementing email security in the enterprise environment. First, there was a big change in email security last year when Google announced guidelines for emails being sent to their inboxes. There are rules that apply to all senders, but there are also additional rules that are specific to senders that send more than 5,000 emails to Gmail inboxes per day. Since February 1st, 2024, all senders must set up SPF or DKIM authentication for sending domains. For those sending over 5,000 emails or more, DMARC authentication must be set up, although the policy can simply be set to P equals none. Now, next, let's talk about some of the challenges in the enterprise environment for email security. Multiple email senders can be configured to send on behalf of a domain. Each email sender needs its own DKIM key. Each DKIM selector used for each DKIM key has to be unique, as the recipient server needs to know which key to use for the domain. This means that you may need to reconfigure the DKIM selector within your email sender if there are any duplicates. Making a change to the DMARC policy can have an impact on email deliverability. This means transitioning from P equals none to P equals reject needs to be carefully planned, and all impacted teams need to be notified and are prepared for the change to occur. The level of complexity for implementing SPF and DKIM depends on the email sender. Just to sum up everything we've covered in today's presentation, passing DKIM proves that the email comes from the email sender and that it wasn't tampered with in transit. Passing SPF means that the email was sent by an authorized sender. DMARC tells the recipient what to do in case an email does not pass SPF or DKIM. There are 3 possible values for the DMARC policy: P equals none, P equals quarantine, and P equals reject. Every authorized sender for your domain needs a DKIM key and or an SPF record. If you're sending emails to Gmail inboxes, you need to implement the Google guidelines. As a reminder, there are rules for all senders, as well as additional rules for senders sending more than 5,000 emails per day to Google inboxes. Lastly, if things aren't configured correctly, changing the DMARC policy can impact deliverability. If an authorized sender's DKIM key isn't in the DNS record for your domain and the DMARC policy is P equals reject, the emails won't be delivered and you won't know unless you have configured monitoring using the RUA tag. Thank you for attending the presentation. Like I said, this was an introduction to email security focusing on DKIM, SPF, and DMARC, but there is a lot more in the world of email security, so I really encourage you, if you're interested, to dive in further. I listed these 2 free tools that are really cool to use when looking up the different records. One is easydmarc.com and the other is mxtoolbox.com. Thank you for attending the presentation. Does anyone have any questions? And I'm just going to pull up the questions. Sorry, technical difficulties. And okay, I got some questions. First one, how frequent or often should an organization audit or update their email security configurations? That is tricky because it will depend on the number of domains, how frequently the organization is changing senders, as well as where they are in terms of their policy. So if they're at the DMARC policy of P equals none, then I'd be monitoring a little bit more frequently. But if they've made it to P equals reject and they aren't adding any new senders, then periodically checking on it would probably be okay, just because you're at more of a maintenance phase. Next question that we have is, how do you balance tight email security with the need to maintain deliverability and not disrupt business operations? After going through this, slow is better. I recommend going as slow as possible and making sure every single possible team that sends email is aware of the changes. Even non-sending teams. I would have emails in newsletters. I would be notifying everyone to make sure they are ready to the change before you change anything. Just because when it comes to email, it can definitely have an impact on a business. So slow and steady wins the race. And third one that we have was, are there free or low-cost tools you'd recommend for small business to validate or monitor their SPF DKIM DMARC records? I would recommend the MX Toolbox as well as easydmarc.com. This will help you check to see if your records are set up correctly. If your IT team is comfortable, it can be done manually by configuring your company's email addresses into those RUA and RUF tags. I personally haven't done it with any open source tools, but so I can't make any recommendations there, but hopefully there are some out there. If someone here wanted to check their organization's email domain for vulnerabilities right now, what's the first thing you suggest they do? First thing that I would recommend doing is check what's publicly available, just your domain into one of those open source tools. What's the policy you're at? Can you see anything related to the DKIM keys as well as the SPF record? And then I would also be checking to see if there are any errors, just because sometimes things get copied over and that type of thing. But yeah, start with the DMARC policy, find out where you are, and then figure out if that's where you want to be. Some companies are okay at staying at P equals none, where others are going to want to get to P equals reject. I think we might be running out of time. We've only got 1 minute left. So I'm going to try and answer the last one quickly. A number of companies have started spoof testing their employees. Is this a practice you'd recommend? I think this is referring to phishing simulation training. I would recommend that just because phishing is a very common initial access vector for threat actors. So doing that type of testing and training for employees can help reduce the probability of an attack occurring. So I think I got to all the questions. Like I said, thank you so much for attending. Please feel free to reach out on LinkedIn if you'd like, and I hope you guys enjoyed the presentation.